Welcome back. So, goaltending. Goaltending is one of the most divisive topics in hockey amongst, well, really all of them. We argue about everything, don't we? So, what makes for a good goaltender? I have really stopped looking at goals against average. I honestly don't pay any attention to goals against average because I don't think that tells you a good story with a goaltender. I do pay attention to save percentage. I think save percentage is good. It's not perfect either. You may have a goaltender with a 920 save percentage who doesn't face the tough shots. You may have a goaltender with an 895 save percentage who's just getting barraged with really difficult shots to save. So both goalies may have had a very good year, but the save percentage will just tell you that the defense they played behind was either great or it was bad. So goals saved above expected is the one that's used by the advanced stats community, and I pay attention to it. I do use that in videos here and there. Goals saved above expected is really it's this whole mathematical idea that you take a look at any shot in a game and you look at the percentage of shots that go in from that angle or from that place. Basically, how dangerous is the shot, and you at the end of the game you look at the dangerous shots. You say, okay, so a normal goaltender might allow 4 goals, and that's the expectation. This goaltender allowed 3, so he saved 1 goal above expected in that game. And so goals saved above expected, I think, is a reasonable stat to use. I don't think there's a perfect stat when it comes to goaltenders, but this is a good one. The problem is, when I use career videos, goals saved above expected isn't a thing until recently. So when I'm talking about a goaltender from the 80s, from the 90s, we didn't have those stats. And it's a shame, because I know Ron Tugnut would have had really good numbers. Anyways, I'm going to go through the 32 teams and their goaltending as it stands right now, September 8th, and just talk about which ones I think are strong and which ones we're going to have to take a look at, right? So I'll do this in alphabetical order. Apologies to Winnipeg, as always. Anaheim, Gibson had a rough year. His goal saved above expected was actually a negative 14.3. So he allowed 14.3 goals above what was expected. And Stolarz was only a negative 1. So Stolarz, by that number, had the better season than Gibson. I do kind of agree with that. Now, Stolarz did play as the backup. He didn't play as much. And for Gibson, it feels like he had a good start, and then it just tailed off for him towards the end of the year, and I think that's where the numbers really turned against him. So for Anaheim, I like their goaltending tandem, but the numbers would tell you they need to play better for Anaheim to get better this year. Gibson can. It's a matter of whether he does. On the Arizona side, I'm not surprised by Vejmelka having a negative 23.2. Vejmelka had some excellent games. He had some huge highlight reel games. He also had some really, really rough games. So I'm not surprised that when it all averages out, he's a negative 23.2. I am surprised that John Gillies, who may very well be the backup, has a negative 16.5. He didn't play that many games. So that's the other thing to consider as well, is when a player's played fewer games, as Gillies has from Vejmelka, the fact he's a negative 16.5 is eyebrow raising, but Arizona's not expecting to win anything. Prosvetov, on the other hand, was a negative 3. So Prosvetov may end up being the backup. It would not surprise me if he beats out Gillies for that job, but at least Gillies is getting an opportunity for said job. Boston, their goaltenders, of course, the big hug after the games. We all love the big hug after the games. Well, I do as a Boston fan. Ullmark and Swayman are still together. Swayman had a plus 4.2 when it came to goals saved above expected. Ullmark had a 5.7. So Ullmark had a better season than Swayman according to that number, and I think that bears itself out. Going into the playoffs, Ullmark was the better goaltender. By the end of that round against Carolina, Swayman was the better goaltender, but I thought Ullmark had the better regular season. Is he worth his contract? You're going to find people who say no because they're going to say no. I think the contract's fine. Buffalo, Comrie had quite the year for Winnipeg. He had a 10.3 in terms of goals saved above expected. That's excellent. Remember, that's as a backup, too. So Comrie's numbers were very good, and that backs that up. Anderson, on the other hand, was a negative 8.7. Luukkonen was a negative 0.048, so right around a 0 for Luukkonen, not bad. Craig Anderson, I do wonder if he ends up being the number 2. And again, with Anderson, I think there's some... I think some of the fandom for Anderson and some of the reason people really like Anderson is because of the storyline of Craig Anderson, how long he's been in the game, and of course all of the great moments for him along the way. The really emotional season that ended up with him winning the Masterton Trophy. We're rooting for Anderson, right? So hopefully that negative 8.7 turns around for him. But if it doesn't, you have Luukkonen, you have Comrie. It's not a bad tandem if that works out for them. Calgary, Markstrom, 10.8. So Markstrom, over the period of a full season, was a 10.8. I think that came down in the second half. It felt like he had a fantastic first half and just couldn't live up to it in the second half. Maybe gets tired here and there. Vladar surprises me at a negative 3.8. So again, if it's a positive, it's in red. If it's a negative, it's in blue, because that's just easy that way. But I'm surprised Vladar's a negative 3.8. I do hope he gets more games. But if they're using advanced stats to look at their goaltending, they might look and say, Vladar's just not getting it done in comparison with Markstrom. We'll roll with Markstrom again tonight. Carolina, of course, Freddie Anderson, if not for injury, might have been closer to that Vezina trophy. His goal saved above expected, 27.8. So that's an excellent number for Anderson. For anybody wondering where I got these numbers from, moneypuck.com. Ronta, 3.7 was the number for Ronta. Not bad overall, but definitely Freddie Anderson was the better of the two. And Kochetkov, considering he didn't play a lot, he had a negative 1, which is okay. Young goaltenders having a negative is not a big deal. Chicago, Mrazek had a rough year. We know this. Negative 11.6 for Mrazek. Stalock was a negative 3.5 in his limited appearances. Soderblom, limited appearances for him, negative 5.8. If Chicago is going to avoid a catastrophic season from a wins perspective, and I understand that they're not trying to get in the playoffs this year, but they need their goaltenders to turn those numbers around, right? Now in Colorado, this one's going to be interesting because Colorado won, and Kemper's numbers were great. We will get to Kemper. Francouz had a 1.9 for his goal saved above expected. Georgiev was a negative 6.8 in New York for the Rangers. Georgiev did have a rough year. His save percentage was below 900, and that negative 6.8 tells you they would have expected him to save more than what he did. So now he gets a chance to prove himself in a clean slate with Colorado. We shall see how that goes. Columbus, Merzlikins had 4 goals saved above expected. Korpisalo a negative 13.2. Tarasov was a 2.6. So part of the reason I've got this up on a board and like this is Tarasov could very well outplay Korpisalo in training camp, and then you have a problem, right? Because Korpisalo's numbers last year weren't very good. Tarasov's were pretty good in his call-up. That's not very many games for him to get that 2.6. So if Merzlikins and Tarasov are the best goaltenders in camp, and you have a Columbus team that wants to make the playoffs because you just added Johnny Gaudreau, you might have to cut ties with Korpisalo, right? So I'm not saying they do. I'm just saying it could happen. Dallas is an example of a goaltender kind of being cut that nobody had expected in Hudobin, who had a negative 8.4 in his appearances last year. It was a rough year for Hudobin. Ottinger, a 1.4. So not a great number for Ottinger. It is positive, but not fantastic. Wedgwood's was actually better, 1.6. So look for Wedgwood and Ottinger to play, not 50-50, but I would think 50 games for Ottinger. I could see 32 games for Wedgwood in terms of starts. I could see that being the case. I think Wedgwood's an underrated goaltender. That number tells me that could very well be the case. Detroit, Ville Husso, 13.5. So he had a rough time in the playoffs. Absolutely agreed. The playoffs were not great for Ville Husso, but he was very good during the regular season. And Nedeljkovic had a negative 6.9. He had a rough second half to the season, as most Detroit Red Wings did. We'll see if he bounces back, and if he doesn't, it may end up being Husso's net sooner rather than later. Now, for the Oilers, Jack Campbell. So I've seen a lot of comments about Campbell. That negative 2.3 for Campbell, again, it feels like he trailed in the second half of the season, that his play fell off, and of course there was an injury in there as well, which may explain some of the reason that he ends up in the negative. Edmonton needs him to be in the positive. They had goaltending that cost them games in the regular season. Goaltending seemed to be part of the difference between themselves and Colorado. There were a lot of differences between Edmonton and Colorado, but if their goaltending's better, it feels like that'll help a lot. Skinner, 0.9, and that's in the positive for Skinner. So Skinner, that number's not bad, and it makes sense to give him a shot at the backup job. He was a plus there, and again, Campbell's going to look to get into the plus this year for Edmonton. Bobrovsky, 23.4 for Florida, and this is one of the reasons why this is a fun stat. Because you look at the overall numbers, Bobrovsky, he's not really living up to his contract, is what you would think looking at your traditional stats. But goals saved above expected, 23.4. So that's an excellent number for Bobrovsky. Knight ends up at 4. So I'm pretty sure he would have been in the negative when they sent him down to the AHL. Knight had a rough time of it there for a while, but by the end of the year, he seemed to have had it back. And that's good news for Florida. I'm sure Knight is the future starter for the Florida Panthers. Then you get to LA, and you've got a tale of 2 goaltenders in LA. Jonathan Quick, 17.8. Now, at one point in the season, I'm pretty sure he was leading the way And I talked about how great it was that Jonathan Quick was having this renaissance season, and then his next game he got shelled. And I take full responsibility. It had to be me in a video. Maybe he watched it and he got overconfident. But still, 17.8 at the end of the season is ridiculously good. Cal Peterson, a negative 8.4. So Peterson needs to bounce back. He needs to put up numbers more like what Quick did last year and prove that he is going to be the starter for the LA Kings. Because another year where he's allowing more goals than he should, the LA Kings may be looking in another direction in goal. Even though Quick's contract is up, they may decide to make a change. The LA Kings are a young, up-and-coming team, and I don't think they're going to wait that long when it comes to the goaltending side of it, especially if this was his final year, right? Minnesota, Marc-Andre Fleury had a rough start to the season in Chicago. We know this. That negative 17.6 does not surprise me. I'm mildly surprised it's as low as it is, but yeah, it was a rough start for him. He's going to be looking for a bounce-back season overall in Minnesota. The Minnesota Wild have gone all in with Marc-Andre Fleury. We will see if the gamble is worth it this year. And Gustafsson had a bit of a rough year too, a negative 6.4. And again, you could look at that and say, well, he was in Ottawa, so of course. But the thing is, another goaltender out of Ottawa had decent numbers. In fact, there were two goaltenders out of Ottawa that had decent numbers that we've got on the board. Gustafsson's negative 6.4 does stand out. Montreal, Jake Allen, a negative 2.2. Not bad. They're probably going to be looking for a similar season from him, and they're going to want him to stay healthy. Montembeault, rough year for Sam Montembeault, negative 17.3. So that's rough. And again, you look at the fact he didn't play very many games. He wasn't the starter. So then negative 17.3 stands out, as does Caden Primo's negative 13.4. So if you were of the mind that Caden Primo looked like he wasn't ready, that negative 13.4, considering he didn't play that many games, it really does stand out. And yeah, hopefully that doesn't carry over into this year. Hopefully this coming season he can stay in the AHL, get that development going, and the following year come up and play for Montreal. Nashville, UC Saros was quite the story. At 20.7 goals saved above expected, he was better than his battery mate, which was David Riddick, who's moved on to Winnipeg. And Lankinen had a brutal season for Chicago at negative 28.6. Chicago's goaltending wasn't bailing them out last year, and again, I've mentioned this in recent videos, there were a lot of bad seasons to go around in Chicago. It's about bouncing back, and for Lankinen, he's with a new team. But worth watching, Connor Ingram, a negative 2.5 during the regular season. Better during the postseason, of course, and I know Ingram will have his supporters because of how he played against the Colorado Avalanche, but I think Lankinen and Ingram, I think it could go either way. But we'll see, right? If Ingram outplays him in training camp, they'll probably go with Ingram. For New Jersey, goaltending was a problem. Blackwood didn't have a great season, negative 12.7 for Blackwood. Vanacek's coming over from Washington off of a down year for him, but he was the best goaltender for Washington, a negative 5.4 for Vanacek. So put together, that's a negative 18.1. If the goaltending allows 18 more goals for New Jersey than they should this year, that could very well sink their playoff hopes. This is a team that, it's going to be tough to make the playoffs in the Metro if they're going to do so. They need Blackwood to get his game back. It's, 3 years ago, I was very much sold on Blackwood. Thought he was one of the better goaltenders in the league, and he was underrated. At this point, though, it really is the jury's out on what the ceiling is for Blackwood. He needs to have that bounce-back year. New York Islanders, Sorokin had an amazing season, 12.8 goals saved above expected. And again, Sorokin was the better of the two goaltenders. Varlamov had a 0.7. It is in the positive, so he did save more than he should have, but it's nowhere near Sorokin's 12.8. Sorokin kind of snubbed when it came to the Vezina vote, but the Vezina vote does get criticized here and there. But remember, the Vezina, up until the early 80s, was awarded to the goaltender and the team that had the lowest goals against average during the season. Just imagine if they changed the Vezina back, the kind of complaining that we'd have now, because then Freddie Anderson and Antti Ranta both would have a Vezina. It worked the same as the Jennings, right? A goaltender has, I think it was 25 games played, they then get given the Vezina. Shesterkin is the story, is the reason that I'm wearing a Rangers jersey. He, far and away, was the best goalie in the league at goals saved above expected at 34.1. So those Igor chants are really well-founded. They're a smart move. And the New York Rangers, again, who've had Van Peesbroek, they've had Richter, they've had Lundqvist. Now they got Shesterkin. And you go back far enough, you got Eddie Jacquemin. There have been some really good goaltenders for the New York Rangers. Embarrassment of riches. And if he has another season like that, look out. Halak ended up even. Halak was even. I'm surprised by that number because it felt like he had a rough year in Vancouver. I was reading sports forecasters saying he's had a couple of good years, and I thought, has he? Well, the 0 isn't awful, so it's not a negative. And considering the way things ended up with Halak in Vancouver, I think you take that 0 and hope for better. Worth noting, Louis Domingue, limited appearances for Pittsburgh, of course, had a positive 3.8. So Domingue and Halak fighting it out for the backup job. On some level, I'm kind of rooting for Domingue because, I mean, the guy's great and just so personable. No offense to Halak, though. Halak's a good goaltender. We'll see how it turns out. Halak, though, it feels like coming off of a couple of bad seasons, but that 0, it's not that bad. Then you have Ottawa, and this is a tale of two goaltenders as well. Cam Talbot in Minnesota was a negative 5.8. Talbot had a good start to the season, and then by the end of the year, it was clear they were going with Marc-Andre Fleury. There was, of course, the awkwardness that takes place from that, and now he's in Ottawa. So I would expect that number to turn around. Forsberg felt like he had a great year because he did. 8.5 goals saved above expected. Anton Forsberg finally gets a job in the NHL. He may end up playing 40 games this year. I think the starts are going to be split between Talbot and Forsberg. I'd be kind of surprised if they weren't. Then you get to Philly. Carter Hart. Not a fantastic year for anybody in Philly. Carter Hart, not an exception. Negative 6.6 for Hart. I thought he played relatively well for a large portion of the season, but he did have some rough nights. That negative 6.6. Interestingly enough, Sandstrom, who may very well be the backup, because the backup goaltender they had expected to get out of Russia doesn't look like they're getting him. So Sandstrom had a 5.2. Yeah, he had goals saved above expected of 5.2. We'll see if that works over a full season if he ends up being the backup. It's possible Carter Hart might get some more nights off. Then you get to Pittsburgh, another team where it's two different goaltenders and there's a large difference. Jari, 12.8. So positive 12.8 for Jari. DeSmith, a negative 0.6. So almost breaking even there for DeSmith. But Jari, who had this fantastic run where I even saw people saying, hey, you know, he should be in the Hart conversation. That cooled off by the end of the year, but still a good year for Jari. He does need to show in the playoffs that he can do that. Of course, Pittsburgh had injury problems come playoffs at goal, and so Jari didn't get a chance to get that redemption. This may very well be the year. Then you get to the interesting part with St. Louis. So Binnington had a great playoff, but he did not have a great regular season. Negative 8.2, and the goals saved above expected. Remember, Husso, 13.5, Binnington, negative 8.2. It is remarkable how a week can change things, how one goaltender can go in net for a playoff game or two and get shelled. The other goaltender goes in and he plays great, and then the narrative changes immediately. This is their goalie. This is the guy. Forget the other. He's a bum. Forget Husso. But Binnington during the regular season was not as good as Husso. And then they bring in Thomas Greiss from Detroit. He had a negative 13.5, which compared to Nedeljkovic's negative 6.9 stands out because Greiss didn't play as many games as Nedeljkovic. So again, it's very interesting to look at these numbers and ask ourselves, so which tandem's going to bounce back and which one isn't? And I will go over them again at the end of this to state which ones I'm really impressed with. So Seattle's got an interesting problem that Drieger's hurt. Drieger a negative 1.6 last year, which for Seattle wasn't bad. Martin Jones coming off of a rough year with Philly, negative 9.4. Again, not alone with those negative numbers in Philly. Grubauer, negative 33.7. I at times last season was accused of picking on Grubauer. I was told that this is all on the defense. It's not on Grubauer. But the fact that Drieger is a negative 1.6 and Grubauer a negative 33.7, to me that tells a tale right there. And so we'll see whether or not Grubauer has a bounce back. One thing that Seattle does have going for them is that both Grubauer and Jones are going to be looking to prove themselves in the National Hockey League. Jones, of course, is going to be aware. Drieger's going to come back, make the decision difficult on which goaltender they're going to keep. And for Grubauer, well, if Jones plays well and Drieger comes back, Grubauer could find himself on the block. So both goaltenders should be highly motivated. Then we get to San Jose. Both goaltenders with a positive, but barely. Reimer, 0.1. It's in the positive. It's a plus, but it's only a 0.1. Kakkonen, between Minnesota and San Jose, ends up with a positive 5.2. So it is interesting that Kakkonen's the one that they end up trading, right? Talbot leaves in the offseason. They keep Fleury, but the one with the best numbers was Kakkonen, which, again, I've been a fan of the player since he came into the league. Let's see whether or not he can do something for San Jose and keep them in the playoff hunt longer than expected. Then you get to Tampa Bay. Vasilevsky, if you look at a lot of his stats, it was an iffy year, whatever, but Vasilevsky in goals saved above expected, 28.4. So that is a very high number. It's right up there with Shesterkin's 34.1. I'm looking for these two to probably be the best two goalies in the league this year. Should be fun to watch games between Tampa and the Rangers, especially given their playoff history now. And then you got Elliott, 3.1 as the backup. That's not bad. Elliott's not going to play a lot. Didn't play a lot last year either. Probably prolonging his career. But for Elliott, a 3.1 isn't bad. Remember, Francouz 1.9, Tarasov 2.6, Ottinger was a 1.4. So Elliott's 3.1 isn't bad at all. And again, goals saved above expected does not reflect the defense playing in front of him. It has nothing to do with it. It has nothing to do with it at all. So it's one of the reasons that the advanced stats crowd really likes the number. Toronto. Show this video to people who watched my channel 6 years ago and they'd be like, really? He's talking about advanced stats? Yes. Toronto, interestingly, Matt Murray, not bad, 3.2. Yeah, Matt Murray was in the positive, 3.2 for Ottawa last year, and Samsonov a negative 12.1. So that positive 3.2 could very well be something that Dubas could hang his hat on. That negative 12.1 for Samsonov, which is not as bad as is worse than Vanacek's negative 5.4. It really could be a matter of two goaltenders just having a rough year for Washington, and Samsonov's young enough to bounce back. So Toronto's goaltending tandem should be a lot of fun to watch. Then you get to Vancouver, and this is bonkers. Demko, 10.5. That's it. Demko, 10.5 in goals saved above expected. He definitely got better after Boudreau got there. He had some rough nights when Green was there. He had some rough nights in general, but more good nights than bad as the season went along. And again, 10.5 is not bad, but it's not Shesterkin level. It's not Vezina level. And then you got Spencer Martin, 9. Spencer Martin didn't play very many games at all, really. 9 goals saved above expected. Makes me a little bit nervous because if he's going to be in there as the backup, all indications are he's going to be the backup for the Canucks this year. Does the NHL get a book on him, and does that 9 become a negative this year? I do have some nervous energy when it comes to Martin. A lot of talk about the blue line in Vancouver, and the blue line's not good enough. They're not going to. But for me, my one thing in the back of my mind that keeps going through is, but is Spencer Martin going to be that backup they need who can give Demko more nights off? Demko needs to play about 50, maybe 55 games at most. You got to have him well rested. Playoff time, you can play him every game. And if they reach the playoffs, it's going to be worth it. And the only way you reach the playoffs, Martin has to show that he's worth those 30 games. Then you get to Vegas. Now, Leonard's number wasn't awful, but Leonard's not playing this year. So it comes down to Logan Thompson, who had a positive 0.6. So not awful, not fantastic, but Logan Thompson, a young goaltender learning his way in the NHL. I think the fact it's a positive is great. Then you have Brossoit, a negative 1.3. So not awful, not great. And then Adin Hill, who had a negative 4.1. So it shows why San Jose would move on from Adin Hill. If they looked at the advanced stats side of it, if they looked at the difficult saves that are being made by their goaltenders, they would see that Adin Hill ranked 3 out of the 3rd. Or 3rd out of the 3. Yeah, that's the math, 3rd out of the 3. So Hill at a negative 4.1. Not the worst on the board, but again, they would have expected more from him. Then you get to Washington. Darcy Kemper. Here it is. 21. 21 goals saved above expected by Darcy Kemper. So for all summer, I keep reading about, well, they didn't need Kemper. Kemper wasn't very good. Actually, in the playoffs, he was remarkably average. I didn't think in the playoffs he played that well. But during the regular season, he was fantastic, especially down the stretch for Colorado. He was amazing the second half of the season for Colorado. And I'm not sure if they have a goaltender that can replicate that, but we'll find out. Then you have Lindgren, 4.5. So if you're St. Louis fan saying, I thought he played really well. He did. 4.5 goals saved above expected. But you've got Fucale with 2.4 goals saved above expected this past year as a reliever, as a third stringer. It'll be interesting to see how the battle between Fucale and Lindgren goes. Lindgren's been in the minors a lot for years. Fucale has as well. There's no guarantee that Lindgren gets that job ahead of Fucale. And then you get to Winnipeg. Connor Hellebuck, 16.7 goals saved above expected. I'm honestly mildly surprised by it being that high, because I thought Hellebuck had a pretty average season for his, compared to his normal standards. I thought it was below his normal standards. But 16.7 is excellent. David Riddick, problematic. Negative 7.5 as a backup in Nashville. Compare that with the 20.7 put up by Saros, and that's how you end up overplaying Saros. But yeah, Riddick's going to be looking to bounce back, and they've got Burden in their system as well, or Burdine in their system as well. We'll see whether or not he comes up and challenges for a job. I didn't see that he got into action last year. So if I had to say which tandems I really like and I think are solid, I would go. I still think Anaheim's should be, and I'm again, the stats would tell you Gibson had a rough year. I think he can bounce back. Swayman and Olmark I think are good, not spectacular. Markstrom, Vladar, I think that's going to be good. Anderson and Ranta, can they stay healthy? Francouz and Georgiev is going to be a fascinating one, right? We expect Colorado to finish first. The goaltending could be a part of that, whether they do or they don't. I do like Ottinger and Wedgwood. If Korpisalo bounces back, Columbus is okay in net. Detroit's going to be fun to watch because does Husso get that job or Nedeljkovic? Skinner, is he going to prove himself as a backup, and how quickly can Campbell get himself established as the starter? I love the tandem of Bobrovsky and Knight. I think that's kind of a perfect one there. Quick and Peterson I should like, but this past season was rough for them. Fleury and Gustafsson, I mean, we hope for bounce backs from the numbers they put up last year. Montreal, they're not in the hunt. That's the same reason that I overlooked the Arizona Coyotes and Chicago Blackhawks. They're all negative numbers for Arizona, Chicago, Montreal goaltenders. The expectation is those are probably your three bottom teams in the league. Nashville, of course, Saros leads the way there. Lankinen or Ingram should be backing him up, and if they back him up well, especially if Ingram gets that chance and he backs him up well, maybe Saros plays a little bit less. Blackwood and Vanacek are both looking for bounce-back seasons. The Islanders, we know their goaltending should be solid, right? Mitch Korn, one of the best goaltending coaches in the league, if not the best, so Sorokin and Varlamov should be just all right. The New York Rangers have Shesterkin, so it might be a situation where it's like Hasek, where it doesn't matter who the backup is. Shesterkin might be the one goaltender who's a throwback. Maybe he can play 70 games in a season. You move on from Georgiev, you bring in Halak and Domingue. Maybe you're okay with playing Shesterkin 65 to 70 games. We'll see. For Ottawa, should be a fascinating story between Talbot and Forsberg, especially since Forsberg's numbers were better than Talbot's. And Philadelphia is probably going to be pretty bad, right? We agree, the channel, myself, that Philadelphia is probably going to be bringing up the rear in the Metro, but Hart's going to be looking for a bounce back, and maybe Sandstrom establishes himself as a backup. Pittsburgh, we know what we're getting with Jarry and DeSmith. Solid goaltending there. St. Louis looking for a bounce-back regular season and a carryover from the playoffs for Binnington and Greiss to have a bounce-back season, which at this stage in his career might be a little more difficult. Seattle looking for goaltenders with a bit of a chip on their shoulder in both Grubauer and Jones. And then, of course, when Drieger comes back, you have a whole other headache for Ron Francis, but that's late in the season. So it's not like it's going to happen in November. That's why they went out and got Jones. San Jose, the goaltending should be solid. Not spectacular, but it should be solid between Kakkonen and Reimer. Tampa has Vasilevsky, much like Shesterkin. Does the backup matter unless he gets hurt? Probably not. But Elliott was a solid backup. Toronto, fascination again. Matt Murray, can he work with Kyle Dubas like they did in the Sioux? We'll find out. And of course, Samsonov could be an ace in the hole. If he has a season like last year, it could be a rough go for him. But Toronto should score a bunch of goals, right? Vancouver, can Spencer Martin be the backup? I talked about this already when I was going through them all. Vegas, without Leonard, I think this is a chance for Thompson to establish himself as a starter in the NHL. For Washington, I love Darcy Kemper's play in Colorado. Do they have a backup that's going to be capable of giving him nights off? Plus, Kemper does get hurt. It does happen, so you may end up with a situation that Washington has Lindgren and Fucale as their goaltenders. Can that get them into the playoffs? And then with Winnipeg, you have Hellebuck's going to be the starter, Riddick looking to bounce back. So there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below, as always, regarding the goaltending in the NHL. And which tandem do you think is the best in the league? And which tandem in the league do you think is arguably the worst? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. I'm just looking. Tandem is tough. This is why I don't really grade out tandems like I used to. And goaltending from year to year is really tough. It is hard to argue against Vasilevsky and Elliott because it worked so well last year. But Jarry and DeSmith, when they're both healthy, that's a really solid, if underrated tandem. But Bobrovsky and Knight. Spencer Knight has a lot of potential. So let me know your thoughts Hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.